On July 20th, 2024, the Sunday Times Magazine published a story called "Meet the Queen of the Tradwives and Her 8 Children." To write this article, a British journalist based in the United States named Megan Agnew traveled to rural Utah to meet a woman named Hannah Nealman, more commonly known by her famous TikTok account handle, Ballerina Farm. On social media, Hannah Nealman posts images of her photogenic, blonde, 10-person family helping her cook and tend to the animals on their enormous homestead farm. The image that she portrays is idyllic and loving, a relic of a more traditional time when kids spent more time running through fields in long dresses instead of yelling at iPads and TGI Fridays. But when the journalist Megan Agnew visited the Nealman farm, she started to notice some signs of something much darker peeking out from beneath this domestic paradise. For example, Hannah revealed that her current reality, which so many followers aspire to, was never truly her own dream. Her real dream of becoming a ballerina was put to bed when her husband, the son of a billionaire, insisted that they get married and start having children before she had graduated from Juilliard. Both Daniel and Hannah come from a very religious Mormon background, and the couple got married after dating for only 3 weeks. Daniel also shares that Hannah sometimes feels so exhausted that she can't leave her bed for weeks at a time. The article about Hannah Nealman, written by Megan Agnew, which has more details than what I shared in the intro, came out and immediately went viral. The piece was very well written, and it started a wider conversation about the trend of tradwives, which is short for traditional wives, who are women on social media who uphold a certain aesthetic, like this old school portrayal of motherhood with homemade food, 50s style dress, and traditional gender roles, in the sense that the women in these arrangements tend to the home and the children rather than holding traditional salaried jobs. But after the article came out, Hannah Nealman posted a video calling this article an attack.
We had a reporter come into our home when we saw the printed article, which shocked us by being an attack on our family and my marriage.
And even responders on the left accused the journalist, Agnew, of biased journalism.
Humans have biases. Megan did not put a lot of effort in to conceal hers. I think the article was diluted by her personal speculations about the Nealmans and her sloppy social commentary.
I will address those accusations later on. So right when this article was going viral and causing a lot of conversation about tradwives on social media, another article came out about another influencer. And this influencer lived over on the East Coast, whereas previously we spoke about a trad wife, homeschooling, rural aesthetic. There are other influencers with a different image. This one of New York City, fashion, movement, money, and glamour. A notable figure among this group was Candice Miller. Candice Miller started a fashion and lifestyle blog called Mama and Tata with her sister Jenna Crespi. Candice is the mama and Jenna is the tata, which means auntie in French. Their site aimed to teach women, quote, how to be a great mom while maintaining beauty, style, and glamour in everyday life, close quote. Candice Miller is a well-connected socialite, cousin to the fashion influencer Ariel Sharnas, friend to the Olsen twins and Ivanka Trump, and the host of some of the most elaborate and costly parties of the Hamptons inner circles. Then on July 3rd, 2024, Candice Miller's real estate mogul husband, Brandon Miller, in his Porsche in the garage of their $15.5 million Hamptons mansion, while Candice and their 2 little daughters were vacationing on Italy's Amalfi Coast. In the wake of Brandon Miller's death, it was revealed that the money used to maintain the elaborate lifestyle did not exist. The family was tens of millions of dollars in debt, and virtually none of the luxury that appeared on Candice Miller's Instagram page, from the boat to the house to the furniture, actually belonged to them. I want to compare these 2 articles, each of which involves a journalist who sought to remove the sheen of filters that covers the lives of famous influencers and their families. And toward the end of this video, I'm also going to go into greater discussion about traditional gender roles and how we engage with them on social media and, as a result, in real life. So first, we're going to go through Agnew's piece about Hannah Nealman, and specifically we're going to address some of the accusations that her personal bias affected the quality and integrity of the article. This piece was published in the Times magazine, not to be confused with the New York Times, which is actually much younger than the Times. The Times is based in London. 2 categories that exist in journalism are straight journalism and immersive journalism. Straight journalism is what we usually associate with journalism. It's an objective third-party report. And the second essay that we're examining today is straight journalism. But this essay, The Queen of the Tradwives, is immersive journalism. It's a profile of Hannah Nealman. So the journalist speaks in the first person about her experience of meeting someone and what her impression of that person was. So when I see people criticizing Agnew's bias in this article, I almost feel as though they've judged it as though it was straight journalism. But this was never meant to be a completely objective report. In an immersive profile, it is well within the bounds of the task of the writer to comment on their experience and their impression of the person in front of them. Of course, there is still a line. You can write about what a person said to you and what your experience was like hearing it, but you can't step back and start to proselytize about your own views. In immersive journalism, there is an added dynamic. The presence of the journalist changes the story because the people there react to the physically present journalist. Remember that for later. My opinion is that this article is very particularly and expertly structured, and the structure of the writing of the article aligns with the structure of the photography. Let me explain. When I first saw this image at the top of the article, I thought it was a strange choice for the featured photo. It's such a great photo. The reason that it confused me is because Hannah's face is obscured. And she's really the only one in this photo with an obscured face. And I thought, well, there are so many people in this picture, most of whom are little kids. So it probably is just really hard to get a picture where everyone is looking nicely at the cameraman. But still, it's strange that the star of the show is the only one who didn't get her full face to be in the picture. But then I realized as I went down the article that the photographer and the writer may have made this decision intentionally. The writer in this article carefully peels back the curtain on this flawless life bit by bit until, in the end, the curtain is flung wide open so you can see what's behind it. And I believe that the photography follows that slow descent as well in harmony with the writing. Starting with gorgeous photos of Hannah Nealman, and then in each photo obscuring her identity a little bit more. I'll explain as we go through. The first two paragraphs read, quote, Hannah Nealman was pregnant with her 8th child and she had 2 due dates. The first was for a baby, obviously. The second, just under 2 weeks later, was for a beauty pageant. Nealman had been crowned Mrs. American in August 2023 at a Las Vegas mega casino and resort, so she was invited back to the city to compete in Mrs. World, parading around the stage in a swimsuit and 5-inch heels, shoulders back and hip popped, spray tanned, glistening, in 12 days postpartum. Obviously, close quote. Agnew goes on to explain the intense beauty regimen that a very pregnant Hannah Nealman subjected herself to in order to look so, quote, perfectly pretty in time for the beauty pageant that was again 2 weeks after the birth of her daughter. She took ice baths in the irrigation ditches on her farm. She took iron supplements and she woke up early to lift weights. She had her daughter like most of her children without any pain medication, and 2 weeks later she was able to zip her swollen, bleeding body into tight leather pants and sequined gowns. She got a spray tan and she flew to Vegas with her newborn and her family of 10 to participate in a Who is the Prettiest Girl competition. When a photo was released of Hannah Nealman nursing her brand new baby girl backstage at the beauty pageant, her social media blew up and she was crowned the queen of the trad wives by her millions of followers, even though Hannah herself never called herself a trad wife. And now, with the backstory, we go into Agnew's interview with Hannah Nealman. Agnew published a piece after the fact that gives us a little insight into her mindset when she first went to interview Hannah. She wrote, "There were so many things I wanted to ask which were inappropriate to do so in front of her husband or young children about contraception, married life, the trials of motherhood, or just simply who she was and what she thought when she was away from it all." Close quote. So that tells us that Agnew arrives wanting to do a profile on Hannah. She wants to get her alone and ask her pointed questions. Spoiler alert, she will not be able to. Now herein begins the descent in the writing that I mentioned earlier, made visible by the photography. At the beginning of the article, Hannah Nealman is the supermom and her husband, the valiant cowboy. The same image that many readers have seen on their social media accounts. The way Agnew describes the couple is fantastic. She says that Daniel Nealman is, quote, an all-American steak of a husband, square-jawed and denim-clad, and Hannah Nealman is, quote, a tiny blonde beauty queen, her hair wet and cheeks flushed, impossibly pretty, close quote. At this point in the article, the photos reflect this image of the couple. This is one of the first photos we see in text. The couple is united, well-dressed, in clear sight. Hannah wears her Mrs. Utah America sash over her pregnant belly, which her outfit has been tailored to fit, as her hair blows in the wind even though she is inside. The next photo shows Hannah serving homemade food to her blonde children in a wooden kitchen while she smiles. The colors are perfectly balanced, steam comes off the spaghetti, and Hannah is the star of the show as all of her children sit patiently and look to her for their dinner. Agnew describes Hannah by saying, quote, "A devout Mormon who was raised in a Mormon family, she bakes perfectly scored sourdough loaves, milks cows straight into her coffee cup, and gives birth by candlelight with no pain relief," close quote. But already at this point, our writer starts laying the groundwork for the descent back to reality that is to come, just as the featured photo foreshadowed. Agnew starts including these little hints of something else, something that isn't quite so picture perfect. First, she mentions that Hannah is repeating lines that are fed to her by Daniel. Then, Agnew poses a question about Hannah's feelings about negative comments, only for Hannah to turn to Daniel and ask him about what upsets her. Then, Daniel is standing behind Hannah and simply answering questions for her, even though they were directed at Hannah, and it's still not too concerning yet, but it affects the feeling of the article. It's almost as if Daniel is looming over everything that she says. When Agnew asks the couple if they like it when Hannah is called a trad wife, Daniel says yes, while Hannah cautiously disagrees and points out that it's not an entirely accurate label. So now it seems that Hannah is uncomfortable. And as the reader, I'm starting to feel uncomfortable too. The writer is painting a tension here, a disconnect in how the husband and the wife feel about being called traditional. Daniel seems fine with it. Hannah doesn't seem fine with it. Later, they get in a 15-seat car, and Agnew asks if they hope to fill it with children. Daniel says yes, immediately. Hannah says that she is feeling, quote, tired and worn out, close quote. Around this time, the photos start to change. Now, as the writing is painting an image of Hannah as more tired, more burdened, the photographs also start to show more work and fatigue. We watch as Hannah milks a cow. We see how her young son holds her littlest baby so she can collect milk. We see her with her youngest strapped to her chest while she leads a cow. Just like the writing, the changes are still subtle. Hannah and her kids still look gorgeous, but now the photos aren't quite so effortless, not nearly as glamorous. Her facial expressions are a bit more concerned, like there's more of a weight on her shoulders compared to the glossy smiles we saw before. Let's continue. Finally, Agnew gets a moment alone with Hannah. So she starts to ask more pointed questions. And now we learn about Hannah's backstory as a person, not just as a mom and a farmhand. I need to sneeze. Excuse me. Agnew asks her, quote, "Is this what you always wanted?" And Hannah responds, "No." And then she catches herself. And she says, I was like, my goal was New York City. I left home at 17 and I was so excited to get there. I just loved that energy and I was going to be a ballerina. I was a good ballerina. By the way, when Daniel walks over and Agnew poses the same question, "Was this what you always wanted?" without pausing to think, he says, yes. Hannah's parents were Mormon with 9 children. Hannah was the 8th. She was homeschooled. Her parents were florists, so she didn't grow up with a ton of money, but she showed a lot of potential and talent in ballet from a young age. So she competed in beauty pageants that offered scholarship money so that she could afford to go to Juilliard in New York City. Juilliard is one of the greatest music schools in the world, and it's usually considered to be the best music school in the United States. Their dance program accepts only 12 women each year. So when Hannah Nealman said, "I was a good ballerina," that's actually not true. She was an exceptional ballerina. Hannah's husband, Daniel, also grew up Mormon and was also one of 9 children, but he grew up in very different circumstances. His father was the founder of JetBlue, making him a billionaire. When Daniel was 23, he saw 21-year-old Hannah at a college basketball game and spent 6 months asking her to go on a date with him, but she repeatedly refused him. Then Hannah mentioned that she was flying back to New York City from Salt Lake, and Daniel realized she was flying with his father's airline. So he pulled a few strings, made a few phone calls, and got himself on the seat directly next to her. She thought it was a crazy coincidence, but it was really Daniel's work behind the scenes. The two started dating. Hannah told Daniel that she wanted to date for at least a year before getting married so that she could finish school. Daniel told her, quote, "That's not going to work. We've got to get married now." Close quote. So 1 month after Daniel sat next to Hannah on her flight, they were engaged. 2 months later, they were married. And 3 months later, she was pregnant. She finished her undergraduate degree at Juilliard with her pregnant belly, and then Daniel moved his family to Brazil, where he would work for his father. We're going to step away from Agnew's article for a moment because Hannah actually kept a blog during this time that paints a more honest picture of her experience living in Brazil. Hannah doesn't speak Portuguese, and the couple at this time only had one car. So Hannah shares in her blog that Daniel took the car to work every day, many days working from 7:30 a.m. to 10:30 p.m., which left Hannah alone and isolated in the house with her newborn. I've actually personally lived in a country where I didn't speak the language before, and I also became quite isolated, but I was very fortunate at that time to have a job in person because it got me out of the house and it helped me get that social interaction that we all need. But Hannah writes in her blog that she didn't leave the house for weeks at a time. She wrote that she starts to get depressed usually around Wednesdays because that's when she feels the effects of not leaving the house for a few days. Of course, during this time, Hannah was also forced to give up dance because of where she was living and how isolated she was, and dance had been her passion since she was a child. She told Agnew in her profile that giving up dance felt like, quote, giving up a part of herself. Some other things that Hannah wrote in her old blog include, sometimes when Daniel's schedule gets very busy and I'm left to handle momhood on my own in a place where I still can't communicate, it gets very overwhelming. We live about an hour and a half away from Daniel's work, and therefore I never see him. This week has been especially bad. I mean, leaves at 8 a.m. and doesn't get home till almost midnight bad. Poor Henry hasn't seen Daddy all week. It's terrible, absolutely terrible. I may or may not have had a major meltdown yesterday and told Daniel I was running away. It was quite the meltdown. The last few days have been especially hard for me. As much as I want to speak Portuguese, I can't, and it gets lonely, really lonely. I have been on my knees a lot lately. This morning I found myself on my knees, my cheeks wet from tears, asking for a friend. Just one. Just someone to talk to. It's so sad. It's clear from these blog posts and from Hannah's story that she is not only a mom and a homesteader, but she is also an artist. And her chosen art form was an art form that you create in community. When you sing with a group of people, dance with a group of people, create shows or theater or become part of an orchestra, there is something about that specific social activity that causes a group to become very close and very in tune with one another. And if we add on top of that Hannah always had a ton of siblings and a religious community to depend on, and for her whole life a studio of dancers who she created with and expressed herself with, to go from having such a close, intimate community of people to being stuck in a house with little kids and no one her age to talk to, of course that was shocking for her nervous system. And being newly married can be tough. It can require a lot of work, especially if you only knew each other for a few months before getting married. There is a lot of negotiating that goes on in those early days while you build the marriage that you both want to have. A lot of defining boundaries and almost a sort of power struggle sometimes. And doing that in a foreign country where you don't speak the language with multiple infants and you have no friends who you can vent to, it can make that process all the more complicated. So compared to this situation, I'm glad that now reading the article, it's clear that the couple gets to spend much more time together. And I was pleased to read in the profile that Agnew's impression was that Daniel is very involved with the kids. That very well could have been something that Hannah negotiated with her husband, something that was important to her. But I do think that these blog posts offer a very interesting window into who Hannah is and what is important to her. Because even today, as a social media star, she still doesn't get to dance. And she still lives in a very physically isolated location. So I ask myself if her dedication to social media possibly came from an intense loneliness that appears to have haunted her adult years. Back to the Agnew article, at this point, the mask starts to really come off and Agnew starts to editorialize more and share more personal opinions. Hannah says that she wasn't the only one who had to make sacrifices when they had kids, specifically in reference to giving up dance. But in her writing, Agnew admits that she disagrees with Hannah. She writes, quote, Daniel wanted to live in the Great Western Wild, so they did. He wanted to farm, so they do. He likes date nights once a week, so they go. He didn't want nannies in the house, so there aren't any. The only space earmarked to be Hannah Nealman's own, a small barn she wanted to convert into a ballet studio, ended up becoming the kids' schoolroom, close quote. So our writer is now directly pointing out that Hannah might not be a completely reliable narrator of her own life. She's writing a story about the erasure of Hannah's identity as an individual. Do I think that the journalist is crossing a line here? Personally, I don't. I think that again, because this is a profile and an immersive journalism piece, Agnew can share her opinion and her impression of the couple beyond just what they say about themselves. It's up to us as readers to decide if we agree with her analysis or not, knowing and understanding that this is the journalist's personal interpretation. Then we get a pretty major reveal, I think, when Daniel says that Hannah sometimes, quote, gets so ill from exhaustion that she can't get out of bed for a week, close quote. Of course, I don't know these people personally, but many readers commented that Hannah seems to be navigating some pretty serious symptoms of depression and burnout, and rightfully asked, if your husband is the son of a billionaire and you're both pretty wealthy in your own right from social media and from your farming business, then maybe you should hire more help around the house if you can, or maybe even just like take a nice trip without the kids, or maybe stop having children. That's a very personal decision, but if she's experiencing burnout, then maybe it's something they would benefit from. Finally, Daniel leaves to take a phone call and Agnew gets a little time alone with Hannah. Hannah shares that her first 2 children were born in a hospital. And then Hannah said, after that, I was like, I'm so ready to go back home. I just love having them at home. It's so quiet, close quote. Agnew asks Hannah why she has her babies without pain relief, and Hannah responds, I don't know, I just have never loved taking it. Except with Martha, I was 2 weeks overdue and she was 10 pounds and Daniel wasn't with me, so I got an epidural and it was an amazing experience. And Agnew asks where was Daniel that day, and Hannah says it was shipping day and he was manning the crew. And then Agnew says, but the epidural was kind of great, and Hannah pauses and smiles and says, it was kind of great. So the reader has caught on by this point that the writer is portraying a sort of expunging of Hannah's identity and individualism, but now we're also starting to wonder if the writer is sharing a specific antagonist behind the erosion of Hannah's self. Agnew continues, quote, I want to ask her about birth control, but we are surrounded by so many of her children, and Daniel is back in the room now too. Do you, I pause and look at her fixedly, plan pregnancies? No, Daniel says. When he says no, Neilman responds gently, it's very much a matter of prayer for me. I'm like, God, is it time to bring another one to earth? And I've never been told no. And then Daniel says, but for whatever reason, it's exactly 9 months after a baby that she's ready for the next one. And then she says, it's definitely a matter of prayer. And then he says, it's a matter of prayer, but somehow it's exactly 9 months, close quote. Agnew then tries to ask about their stance on abortion, but a child interrupts shouting, Mama, 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 I want to go to ballet now. So Agnew writes the paragraph that could be pushing the boundaries when it comes to personal bias. Quote, I can't, it seems, get an answer out of Neilman without her being corrected, interrupted, or answered for by either her husband or a child. Usually I am doing battle with steely Hollywood publicists. Today, I am up against an army of toddlers who all want their mum and a husband who thinks he knows better, close quote. In my personal opinion, this could be when she starts to cross the line into sharing a little bit too much of her personal thoughts of emotions. I think you could also argue that in some of the questions that she asked beforehand, some of the ways that she pushed Hannah, it seemed like she was trying to get a specific answer, specifically about the epidural. I think that Agnew maybe got trapped a little bit in the structure. She's been peeling back this curtain bit by bit for a lot of the article, and now the curtain is flung wide open, and since she followed that structure, the logical conclusion of this article is to state point blank how she really feels about Hannah's situation, how she really feels about this man. But personally, I don't think that she needed to. I think that the rest of the article was so well written, and the scenes that she painted and the dialogues that she included elicited the same feeling of frustration in me that the writer felt, without her having to explicitly say that she couldn't get time with Hannah without being interrupted. Overall, I do think that Agnew's perspective in this article was quite fair, but when I discuss the article, I'll go a little bit more into detail. I'm glad that Agnew finished the article with an effective anecdote, not with an opinion. Quote, why, I ask before I leave, did she do those pageants in between babies? And Hannah responds, well, my sister called me and she said, there's a Mrs. Utah, let's do it together just to break things up. And the sequined gowns, Agnew asks. Well, they used to be in her bedroom cupboard, but with all of her stuff, and Daniel's and Henry's and Charles's and George's and Frances's and Lois's and Martha's and Mabel's and Flora's, the cupboard got so full that there wasn't any more room. So Daniel put them in the garage, close quote. So Agnew managed to both begin and end her article with these perfect little microcosmic examples of how Hannah keeps getting pushed out of her own story. To finish, I'd like to go back to the photography for a moment. The final photograph portrays Hannah again, this time standing alone. Remember, we started with, yesified Hannah and then Campesina Hannah, and now in the final photograph we see her pretty face obscured. This is when I realized that the obscuring of her face in the first photo was also likely a deliberate decision, and similar to the writing of this article, we bookend her story with the vision of her as mysterious and interesting, but also only really half there, because her hair covers her face. And your hair can be such a symbol of your femininity and youth and fertility, and so there might be something to be said for the fact that her hair is what covers her identity and causes us viewers to wonder if she hadn't been born a woman, if she didn't have the pressure that comes with femininity in her community, perhaps she would have been able to pursue her art form and reach actualization and fulfillment as an artist and as a person, and have children, if that was what she wanted. So I do not know these people. I don't know anything about them and their personal life aside from what I read in this article. So what I'm going to do is look at this article and a little bit of what I shared about Hannah's blog as an independent piece of literature and use it as a vehicle that brings us to greater discussions about marriage and feminism. I'm not even necessarily saying that these discussions relate directly to Hannah Nealman and her husband, but there are likely people who follow them who have dealt with some of the things that I'm going to mention, so I still feel that it's relevant. So what it appears that Agnew is portraying in this work, again, not necessarily what Hannah Nealman is actually living through, but what is being portrayed, looks to me like a psychological leash. Psychological leashes can exist in all sorts of relationships, but they most commonly exist in marriages or between a parent and child. So let's take an example of a mother who puts a psychological leash on her son and inadvertently creates a man-child. Let's say the mother equates being needed with being loved, or maybe she was abandoned by other people in her life and she fears being abandoned again by her child, so she either consciously or unconsciously puts a psychological leash on her child. She teaches her son that the outside world is scary and unpredictable, while depending on her is the only truly safe and comfortable place in the world. Her child goes out and has their first major failure in life. Could be a failed business, could be college, but instead of letting him work through that failure on his own and come out better, but perhaps less dependent on her on the other side, the mother tells him, "See, the world is dangerous, and it's unfair, and there's no use in trying. You should just come home and be with mama where you're safe." And yes, the fault is on the mother for putting the psychological leash on her son and raising a man-child, but it is also on the son for never taking that leash off and instead trading in his freedom for treats and belly rubs. Now imagine the psychological leash of a young girl, daddy's little princess, who then grows up and the time comes for a transfer of power. What should be a transfer of power from the parents to their now adult daughter instead becomes a transfer of power from father to husband, especially if you're in a community of people who tend to be more traditional when it comes to gender roles and tend to get married quite young. Let's expand on that example. A girl was on a psychological leash with her parents. Her parents were very strict and they instilled in her a fear about the world. They were especially controlling of her sexuality, who she dated, perhaps the way she dressed, her body, her appearance. For this girl, that criticism and that scrutiny feels like home. She internalizes it. She starts to apply these high standards to herself. When she speaks about control, she instead calls it protection. She seeks out partners who exert similar control, who have similarly high standards for her. She meets a man who has his own insecurities, as we all do. Maybe he was abandoned before by a parent. Remember that if a parent is constantly working and never sees their kids, that can feel like abandonment for a little one too. Or maybe he was dumped by a different lover. Or maybe he has issues with his own self-worth. And all of a sudden this woman comes into his life and she's so beautiful. And she comes from a nice family and she's a fantastic dancer, goes to frickin' Juilliard. And maybe she's impressive on her own accord, while you worry that you're only impressive because of things that were given to you by an impressive father who has left some impossibly big shoes to fill. And maybe after they get married, her husband starts to worry that one day she'll wake up and realize that she can do better and she'll ditch him. So there's a dark, insecure part of him that he might not even be conscious of that starts seeking out control. And maybe he does this by tearing her down in little ways because he thinks that this will keep her dependent on him, make her afraid of living without him, and prevent her from leaving him behind. So he chips away at her confidence in herself so that slowly she gives him more and more power over her life. And in reality, the only way that you get better at doing things is by doing them and failing and doing them again. So if her parents didn't trust her enough to let her make mistakes and learn, and then her husband doesn't let her make mistakes and learn, over time, maybe she really does become less capable. Maybe she really does have less confidence in herself. And after years and years of this behavior, scraping away at her ability and confidence and sense of self, she finds herself one day being asked how she feels about something in an interview, and all she could do is turn to her husband and say, "How do I feel about that?" And I say all of this about the psychological leashes because often when I see people respond to trad wives, they say, "Be careful, that man can leave you, he can cheat on you, he can abuse finds you. If you don't have your own finances and resume set up, then you won't be able to leave him. And I think that's a very relevant argument. But sometimes the consequences of a traditional relationship aren't quite so dramatic. Sometimes the issue is just a slow chipping away at the identity of one person in the couple until eventually they become a supporting character in someone else's life instead of the main character in their own.
Birthday present from Danielle. Tickets to Greece. So, plane tickets? A hat I can wear in Greece.
It's not a hat.
Oh, my A-game friend!
It's great. I can gather eggs. You're welcome.
Thanks, honey.
Now, I do want to not necessarily argue against myself, but add another perspective or another interpretation to this conversation. Hannah Nealman is a performer, a social media star, a beauty queen, and a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. So what I'm seeing here is a woman who is very image focused and very media trained when it comes to presenting herself to others, both physically and otherwise. When Megan Agnew came to Hannah Nealman's house, Hannah probably assumed or recognized, rightfully, that she was speaking to someone who is more feminist, more modern, secular, possibly more left-leaning than she is, and she probably thought of the audience of the Times in that way as well. If you're English, you might say the Times is conservative-leaning, but the Overton window in the United States is shifted to the right, so the Times and probably any European publication would still probably be perceived as quite liberal by a true red, white, and blue-blooded Manifest Destiny God-fearing American Mormon. All of this is to say, I think that some of the tension that Agnew was picking up on in this article wasn't always necessarily the tug of a psychological leash from Hannah Nealman's imposing husband, but rather the tension inside Hannah of wanting to be perceived well by this interviewer sitting in front of her and the interviewer's audience, and also her own audience and her own community. For example, Agnew asks Hannah if she considers herself a feminist, and Hannah says, I feel like I'm a feminist, and then she stops herself, and then she says, there's so many different ways you could take that word. I don't even know what feminism means anymore. To me, that doesn't read so much as, I'm worried my husband will be mad at me if I say I'm a feminist, although it could be. It reads a little bit more like, I can tell that you and probably other people want me to say that I'm a feminist, but I'm worried about how that will be perceived in my audience and among my family and friends. Still, if you notice, in all of these interpretations, what is consistently missing is Hannah's own personhood. It's always someone else's wants and feelings prioritized, whether that's her husband, her children, Heavenly Father, or us. The millions of eyes watching and judging her. That's a difficult position to be in, and I don't envy it, because by worrying about others first and foremost, you can put yourself in a perpetually losing position, because you can't make 1,000,001 people proud. You can't even make 2 people completely happy, but with introspection and focus, you can be proud of yourself, which makes self-love a far more reasonable goal. Agnew went deeper into the tradwife trend in her article, and how it is one small part of a larger social feeling. I will respond to that as well. But first, let me share the next article with you so that it can contribute to and inform the discussion at the end. Okay, so this next article is a little bit heavier, and it comes with a slide mentions trigger warning. This piece was published in the New York Times on August 8th, 2024. And it's titled How an Instagram Perfect Life in the Hamptons Ended in Tragedy. It was written by Catherine Rossman. Remember that whereas the last article was an example of immersive journalism, this article is straight journalism. So the journalist is not a first-person observer. She is instead ideally absent. So this article is shorter and it's a little bit more dry, which could be better because that gives us a level of separation when dealing with subject matter that can be a little bit emotionally taxing to discuss. The subheading is, Candice and Brandon Miller showed the public a world of glittering parties and vacations. The money to sustain it did not exist. And the first paragraph reads, in the modern Gilded Age of New York, where Instagram is awash in unrestrained displays of wealth, Brandon and Candice Miller were royalty. It's a great hook. Both of the articles that we're looking at today had a good hook. Then the journalist sets the scene that she presumably hopes will speak to the wealth and extravagance of this influencer and her husband. For the 10th anniversary party of Brandon and Candice Miller, Candice threw a party with the theme Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare play. Rossman, the journalist, goes on to tell us a little bit about the Mama and Tata Instagram account with around 80,000 followers. Candice Miller was the owner of the account and the host of this midsummer party. She was celebrating her 10th anniversary. She talked to a lifestyle blogger at the party and said that her husband's speech made me cry by the end with his authentic, raw emotion and romantic words, close quote. While the last article started with the life that the influencer portrayed and then slowly revealed bit by bit what is really going on when the cameras are off, Rossman instead reveals the tragic end of the story toward the very beginning. After describing the midsummer party and telling us a bit about the glitz and the glam of the Mama and Tata Instagram account, she then writes, quote, "The midsummer night party was in 2019. 5 years later, the glamorous image that Miss Miller cultivated and promoted has disappeared, replaced with heartbreak, anger, and a mountain of once secret debt. Her husband is gone. The home that they so ostentatiously lived in, saddled by several mortgages, is not truly their own. Lawsuits from creditors, business bankruptcies, botched investments, and even a repossessed boat, the Miller time, indicate that the wealth needed to maintain their lifestyle had evaporated, if it ever truly existed. Mr. Miller, 43, died at a Southampton hospital. The side note indicated he had cancer while his wife and children were on vacation on Italy's Amalfi coast." Okay. The writer now finds herself in a uniquely difficult situation because the subjects of her article, Candice and Brandon Miller, on one hand, are alienated from the average reader by wealth and celebrity. The money that these people spend flippantly to impress their friends could change the lives of many people who are probably reading this article. Some people in many religious texts actually call this an immoral level of wealth hoarding. And the writer must consider that there are likely people in her audience who are going through financial issues right now, like housing and food insecurity, a lack of accessibility to healthcare, very real, immediate dangers due to their financial situation. And maybe those people aren't going to be particularly sympathetic to the influencers in her article who would happily drop $15K on a half birthday party for their 2-year-old. This reality creates a level of separation between the reader and the people they're reading about. I would argue that a piece that doesn't point out this separation, these absurd levels of spending and wealth inequality, would be incomplete, and a journalist striving for a more objective profile ought to at least be aware of this absurdity. Then, on the other hand, the writer has a task that may prove to be even more difficult, which is to still, despite it all, recognize the humanity of these people. Because one of the subjects of this article, Brandon Miller, felt such levels of despair and inner decay that he couldn't bear one more day as a human being. And so he chose to leave his 2 little girls without a father. And while we may not have ever touched the levels of opulence that Candice Miller happily flaunted on her Instagram account, many of us can, unfortunately, understand what those levels of despair can feel like. So the journalist who strives for objectivity, the writer who hopes to succeed in writing about subjects like this, subjects who on one hand are so separated from the average human experience and on the other hand have publicly suffered the uniquely human tragedy of must have the courage to criticize and comment on wealth and power inequality, but also they must have empathy, a heart big enough to encompass even those who are most distant from us in terms of power and wealth, who are in this moment experiencing crippling grief. So, courage and empathy. I would argue that the best writers have heightened levels of both. If you want to read an example of a piece that struck this balance very well, I would recommend reading Taffy Brodesser-Akner's 2015 GQ story about Justin Bieber joining a church. Brodesser-Akner acknowledges kind of like the silliness and absurdity of writing a story about this hyper-wealthy teenager joining this like hip celebrity megachurch, but she also really grapples with Justin Bieber's humanity, and she gives a very empathetic profile of the pain that he experienced that ultimately drew him to religion. So back to the article, the writer reveals that there was a business deal that Brandon Miller was hoping would save his family from their financial troubles, and it didn't go through, or so he wrote in his letter. The New York Times reached out to Candice Miller for comment, and a spokesperson said on her behalf, Candice is devastated by the loss of her soulmate, and her 2 young daughters' lives are forever impacted by the loss of their beloved daddy, close quote. Then she ends the intro by writing, quote, a chasm separated the Millers' shimmering public lives and painful private reality, but their fall is also a source of very real grief, a story about trying to have it all and what happens when you cannot. And then she has a quote from Marley Miller, who is Brandon Miller's sister, in which she says, What some people aren't discussing in all of this is the loss of my little brother, someone I have loved unconditionally. I have a hole in my heart that will never be filled. I am completely devastated. So what I see here is the journalist setting an intention for facing what she calls the very real grief of this situation. Since this is straight journalism, she is limited in just how much emotion she can put into this piece. So she's instead using quotes from people who were affected by Brandon Miller's death more closely to fill in the gaps about how challenging this is for them. For people like me who had never heard of the Mama and Tata Instagram account, Rossman gives a little background saying that Candice Miller was once known for big spending. She shared many photos of private fitness sessions, private jets, private chefs, private drivers, Manhattan high-rises, and vintage designer gowns. In one interview, Candice Miller sat in an all-white room with her 2 little daughters. The journalist writes that even the books on the walls had uniform white spines, which reminded me of the scene in The Great Gatsby when Jay Gatsby shows Nick Carraway his fantastic library filled with books. But back then, when they first printed books, you would have to, the pages were attached. So if you wanted to open and read the book, you would have to trim the edges of the pages. And Nick Carraway notices that all of Gatsby's books have not been cut, meaning that he has not read them or even opened them. And this scene speaks to the superficiality of Gatsby's life. He was more concerned with the status and image that comes with owning a lot of books than he was with the actual act of reading a lot of books. I think about this scene often, especially when I see books being used as some sort of interior design prop. And Miller's story is very Gatsbyan. I'm actually surprised that the journalist never described it in that way. There are these stories about people who tried and sometimes succeeded to portray a certain image, but because they were more preoccupied with seeming smart and rich and successful than they were with being any of those things, then their stories ultimately ended in the death of that person who was trying to reach across the gap between seeming and being. And while Candice Miller isn't considered a trad wife because she matches a more modern aesthetic, the gender roles in her house were traditional in the sense that she was a stay-at-home mom and her husband focused on his business, a business that the 2 of them, according to this article, quote, rarely discussed. Now, in the article, we get the background on Brandon Miller, whose father had a family real estate business. Together, Brandon and his father bought many buildings across New York City. Because of Brandon Miller's father and his business, Candice and Brandon, who actually met when they were kids in the Hamptons, were able to live as if they were hugely successful mega millionaires, even when they were a young married couple. But then Brandon Miller's father passed away unexpectedly in 2016, and Brandon Miller took over his father's business. But then he was suddenly hit with a bunch of lawsuits that came about essentially as a result of loose ends that his father didn't really get to tie up before his untimely death. And Brandon Miller was also really focused on commercial real estate, like office buildings. So when the pandemic hit, their business took another big loss, and the value of commercial real estate still hasn't gone up to those pre-pandemic levels. So the Millers had to sell the house that they had gotten with the help of Brandon Miller's father. They rented out a 5-bedroom apartment on Park Avenue for a smooth $47,000 per month, which is so much fucking money. So much fucking money that they did not have. At this point, according to the article, Brandon Miller starts missing payments. For example, he stops paying for the docking fees on his boat, the Miller Time. And as a result, I'm thinking, okay, stop spending that much money on things you don't need. From the outside, the answer seems really obvious. And the writer has done a good job of portraying it that way. But from the inside of this insular community, these people seem to feel like they have to spend crazy money so that they can keep up appearances. Even though for us normal people reading this, it's like, baby, make a budget, you know? But the tragedy of this story is that for whatever reason, be it social pressure or internal pressure or marital strife or all of these above, these people could not stop spending money. And our writer starts to bring us down that rabbit hole with them. Brandon Miller takes out a $6 million loan from a traditional bank, then a $2 million loan from a 24-hour cash loan business. He starts asking his friends for money. All the while, Candice Miller is still throwing expensive coastal parties and bragging to blogs about her favorite shopping spot is obviously Chanel in East Hampton. So Brandon Miller has been depending on his rich friends to stay in business, But now his friends start looking into the projects that they have invested millions in, only to find out that they don't exist or that Brandon Miller isn't involved. So they get together, and this is what they describe in the article. His friends get together to confront him and ask where their money is. And Brandon showed up to this sort of intervention, and they say, "How are you?" And he's like, "I'm actually really sad. It's the 7th anniversary of my dad's death, and I just got back from visiting my dad's grave." And his friends were like, "Oh man, that sucks. Like, maybe this isn't the time, but like, where the fuck is my money?" And Brandon Miller apparently broke down in tears and said that he didn't do anything wrong, but he felt like he let his friends down. And one of his best friends, who remained nameless in the article, apparently realized that he wasn't going to get his money back, even though it was millions of dollars. And so he walked out and he never spoke to Brandon again. So this community of people who they are spending so much money to try to impress is now falling apart. And it's not just his friends who are coming to collect their money. Now creditors start showing up to collect as well. Different services that they haven't paid for started suing them. One firm that had lent Brandon $36 million for a payment started attempting to collect what he owed them. The furniture rental company that said that the Millers owed them more than $100,000 in fees and in furniture that they didn't return. Around this time, Candice Miller does an interview in The Times sharing that she spends $3,200 a month on facials. The writer has done a great job of structuring this part of the article where she shares, one, some huge number that Brandon Miller owes and that he's not paying, and then two, some huge number that Candice Miller is spending on just like frivolous shit. The writer actually dug up a Times article from around this time written specifically about Candice Miller's Botox and facials habits, in which Candice shares that every week she gets an $800 remodeling facial during which they inject radio frequencies into your face, obviously not an expense that can be cut. Brandon Miller is still taking out these short-term loans. He took out a $208,000 loan in early June, just a few weeks before he passed. If you're familiar with short-term loans like these, then you know that they can be very aggressive. They were almost definitely coming for his house, but there's also a chance that there were threats against his life, threats against his family. Loans like these can be very predatory. Also consider that, and I don't know the terms of these specific loans that he was taking out, but many loans are forgiven if you die without repaying them. So if you consider that Brandon Miller was likely already experiencing dark thoughts or depression, and depression tells you that the people who you love would be better off without you, then on top of that, he thinks that in his death, his wife and kids can live a better, or at least more financially stable life. These people seem to equate those two things. Then you can start to see why he made the decision that he did. So the friends of Mr. Miller started pressuring him to tell his wife about their financial problems, since it still seemed like she didn't know, both from her public image and what I guess she said to other people. But he refused to tell her until eventually one of his friends called Candice Miller himself and told her point blank, "Your family is broke." And so she confronted her husband, and he told her that they would meet with a lawyer and work it all out. But they had already booked a trip to Southern Europe. So he told her, "You should go with the kids, and I'll stay behind and close a deal that would supposedly make all of their financial issues go away." So she goes to Europe, and she's already posting these lovely photos of herself and her girls in Spain and Italy. And then according to her travel agent, her card started declining and the travel agency had to pick up the bill. So 2 days before Brandon Miller texted his wife, and he told her that the deal that he was waiting for that would solve all of their problems had closed, but the deal didn't exist. And then on July 30th, the police responded to a carbon monoxide alarm, and they came to his house to find that he had died in his car with a photo of himself and his family. He wrote an email intended for his wife in which he said that he had taken out a $15 million life insurance policy that should help her. He also admitted that he had lied about the financial deal that was going to save them. He said that he had been living with dark thoughts for a long time, but he also said that he loved his wife and children, and his decision was, he felt that was what would be best for them. And then the last paragraph of this article says, quote, "The dismantling of their dream life began almost immediately. A mortgage lender sued Miss Miller for $800,000 in missed payments and interest. The Miller time was repossessed," that's their boat, and the Mama and Tata Instagram account was pulled offline, close quote. That's the last line of the article. The New York Times published a follow-up to this article in the end of 2024, in which they revealed that Candice Miller, while she did receive the life insurance policy that Brandon Miller mentioned, is still living with a lot of debt, and she's currently involved in multiple lawsuits attempting to prove that she should not have to pay it. So if she wasn't involved in the family's finances previously, then she certainly is now. Despite that debt, she is living in a $10 million beachfront mansion in Miami Beach, owned by or associated with the socialite and businessman Prince Alexander von Furstenberg, which is a name that if you say it 3 times in front of a mirror, it causes your net worth to go up. One of the lenders who was pressuring Mr. Miller to pay one of his loans back during his lifetime has said that he now regrets how much pressure he applied. So I can only assume he became a debt collector because he thought it would make people happy and was surprised when it made them want to themselves. The article also mentions that Brandon Miller's mother, Barbara Miller, passed away in early December, and her daughter, who was quoted in the original article, Marley Miller, wrote, "Our beautiful Barbara passed away with a broken heart, and we are desperately trying to find comfort and peace in knowing that she has been reunited with her beloved husband, Michael, and her precious son, Brandon," close quote. Okay, let's discuss. As always, there were some things I thought this article did well and other things that I feel it could have done better. The research that went into this article was fantastic. They got details and information from so many different people and they assembled it in a way that made sense. I say they, not she, because the article mentions that Rossman had help with the research and reporting. Rossman also did a great job of juxtaposing the financial issues of Brandon Miller, these huge amounts of money that he owes, with the way that they keep spending money, and Candice Miller keeps posting about how much money they have and what a luxurious life they led. And in the context of this major, shocking death in their family, it really highlights just how little all of that other bullshit matters. Like, we have one short life and it's often very difficult or at least tiresome to be alive, but the greatest solace is that we get to share this limited time on earth with people who we love, and that love gives meaning to our lives. And as Viktor Frankl argues in Man's Search for Meaning, having meaning in your life can be just as necessary for survival as having food and water. And Frankl makes a strong argument that finding meaning is often, without hyperbole, a matter of life and death. And he survived the concentration camps, so he knows a thing or two about life and death. So to take something so profound and necessary to human existence as love itself, or the person who you love the most, and to trade that in for money that you're only using to have a prettier Instagram than your friends and to buy what some marketing company told you to want. Like, if you ask me, that's a bad deal. And I felt that this article highlighted just what a bad trade it is, and it left us with the assumption that Candice Miller would take it all back if she could. But I do have some criticisms for this article. One is that there was almost an over-reliance on numbers and details found during research. Maybe if you really wanted to understand the logistics of Brandon Miller's financial problems, then you would like this more, but for me, it kind of slowed down the pacing of the article and it made it sound convoluted when there were big sections of the article that sounded like this, quote, "Instead, they rented a 4,382 square foot 5-bedroom apartment on the corner of Park Avenue and East 71st Street, according to court records, keeping up appearances for $47,000 per month. They decorated with rented furniture, for which they paid $180,000 for 1 year, according to a lawsuit filed this spring, and $12,000 per month after the first year." Phew! Like, do you see what I mean? What a mouthful. My other criticism is that I do feel that the writer could have leaned into Brandon Miller's humanity a little bit more. I think there was intention at the very beginning of the article to do that, specifically when she talked about the very real grief of this story, but I felt that there wasn't really follow through. And you could say, well, this is straight journalism, it's going to be a little bit more dry, and I do agree, but I think that Rossman could have played with the order of the article a little bit more. For example, she could have ended the article with maybe one of the quotes from his family, or the fact that he died with a photo of his wife and girls, or the age of his daughters, instead of ending the article with the fact that the Mama and Tata Instagram account is now deleted. I would hope that the Instagram account is the last thing on the minds of the family right now, and I know that Candice Miller committed a grave error in posting her life online and specifically using her account to essentially boast wealth that wasn't there, and there is almost a masochistic sense of validation in finding out that these wealth influencers are full of shit. But I don't think that that's the main story here that we should focus on, because the Instagram account wasn't real. But the years of pain that this man felt were very real. The silent plane ride that Candice Miller took back to the United States to attend her husband's funeral was real. The 2 little girls who can't even fully understand or process the grief that they have right now, and this grief that will touch them for the rest of their lives, that's also real. And it can be difficult for writers and people in general to really look down the barrel of that sadness and that heaviness. But in order to tell a complete story, I think that as writers, we must be able to. Now, why did I choose to discuss these 2 articles together? I would love to hear you notice similarities and differences in the 2 stories in the comments below, but here are a few similarities and lessons to be learned that I noticed. For one, these stories both had an aspect of exposing the reality behind the lives of influencers. And while you've likely heard it a million times that what you see on social media is not real, I think it's always a point worth repeating. Both of the women in these articles, Candice Miller and Hannah Nealman, are sort of like photographers, and we should look at their social media pages as these like curated art exhibits that are meant to communicate certain messages or promote certain products. In more cases, instead of an accurate reflection of a stranger's life. And when the article about Hannah Nealman came out, there was a lot of discussion about trad wives, and her followers who came to her defense all said essentially the same thing. Well, it's her choice, right? Shouldn't women be able to choose what they want to do? And if she chose to be a homemaker, then that could even be seen as a feminist act because it was her choice. And I think that's an okay point, but I also think that it's a very reductive argument. Megan Sanders' video called "We Need to Talk About Ballerina Farm and Choice Feminism" gave a very well-written rebuttal against this idea that choice is inherently feminist by basically raising the point that yes, Hannah Nealman chose this, but if she was raised by and molded by a community that has sexist and retrograde views when it comes to gender and sexuality, then that choice was not entirely her own. NPR did a story recently about ex-trad wives, and one of them shared that when she was a little girl growing up in a Mormon family, she wrote in a class project that she wanted to be president when she grew up. And when she got home, her mother saw this project and burst into tears and told her, "But you can't be president. Heavenly Father needs you to be a wife and a mommy." And if that little girl then grows up to be a wife and a mommy, you can't ignore how much socialization influenced that decision by oversimplifying the whole situation into, it was her choice. Brandon Miller chose to decide, but any conversation that ignores the societal and financial factors that drove him to his death is incomplete. And one thing that I would like to add to the choice feminism conversation is that it tends to focus specifically on religion, as if Mormons were the only ones influenced by their social groups, but we are all members of cultures and subgroups that dictate when we have kids, when we get married, the clothes we wear, the jobs we look for. Candice and Brandon Miller were also members of a social class. They're members of a high society that expected a certain income level for them. And that kind of social pressure can be secular, yet equally as suffocating as religious. And to go back to the influencer conversation, that social pressure doesn't just come from your social environment anymore. Now it also comes from these strangers who influence us online. I mused about this a lot in an article called "All My False Gods" on my blog, which I linked in the description if you would like to read it. Now, in her article about Hannah Nealman, I promised I would come back to this, Megan Agnew at one point stepped back from Hannah's personal story and put the trad wife trend in a greater context. She said that there was a sort of girl boss feminism that put the onus on women to exert themselves in order to overcome inequality and prejudice. And she sees this trad wife cosplay as a sort of reaction to that. The trad wife lifestyle presents itself as an easier alternative to girl bossing. And I think I understand that, right? Becoming a farm girl trad wife, there's something about it that seems very tempting. I mean, you don't have to worry about corporate pressures. You get to live in the fresh air and dress like Jessie from Toy Story. And there is something about relinquishing control that sounds very relaxing, especially in the modern world where so many of us suffer from decision fatigue. It sounds nice to not have to make major decisions because your husband takes care of it for you. But, and I'm really sorry to be the one to burst your bubble here, homestead farming is incredibly difficult. Raising children is exhausting work. Giving birth in an attic with candles is probably harder, to be honest, than anything I've ever done in my life. I think many of the people who see these trad wife lifestyles, especially on social media, maybe didn't have the chance to really explore their careers before having kids. But I have, and I'm sorry, you will not convince me that my fully remote digital marketing job is harder than raising a Duggar-sized family on food that I pulled out of the ground.
And then, should we end it with best or sincerely?
What about warmly?
Ooh. Another blight has befallen the potato crop.
To be honest, I think that homestead farming looks really cool. I love looking at Hannah Nealman's account. Like, she's curated this simple, peaceful image, and it's awesome. Like, she's a talented artist, you can tell. But if you choose the tradwife lifestyle for its ease, then I believe that you've been misguided. And even if the pilgrim lifestyle was actually easier than a modern working woman's lifestyle, I don't think that you should necessarily build your life around ease. You should build your life in a way that feels true to you, with challenges that you accept and then overcome. You can and should do difficult things, but do them because it's what you want to do and what will bring you fulfillment, not because an influencer or your husband or wife or parents or children expected you to become some embodied stereotype. Because if you go that route, then you'll wake up one day with a life that isn't really yours. When feminists preach this message of like individual empowerment, we're often accused of being anti-family or anti-marriage, but I would argue that the evidence shows that empowering women is healthier, not just for women, but also for children and families. Here are some examples to clarify what I mean by that. Studies show that the education level of the mother is one of the strongest predictors, not just in the education level of the children, but also in children's health. This is in large part because educated mothers are more likely to seek out preventative care, trust doctors, and offer healthier environments for their kids. Women as a whole staying in school greatly reduces the rates of infant mortality on a societal level. Studies have shown that when women control household spending, there is a direct positive impact on the nutrition, healthcare, and overall well-being of children. Women with greater autonomy and access to resources experience lower levels of stress and depression, which in turn leads to better emotional and physical health for their children. Women with autonomy over their own healthcare, specifically with access to family planning methods like birth control, leads to lower maternal mortality, healthier pregnancies, and again, healthier children. People with higher levels of social support, like a group of friends or a supportive family, tend to have better health, and their social networks can also improve the health of their children by providing emotional and practical support during times of need. Studies consistently show that women who are empowered through education, economic opportunities, and social support systems experience better physical health. Women who are economically empowered tend to have lower rates of chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, which are critical for both maternal and family health. These facts that I've just listed don't come from new or bare bones research. These are well-established sociological findings. A society born to mothers who are educated, socially supported, mentally healthy and happy with control over their finances and bodies will statistically outperform a society born to disempowered or victimized mothers in every category. And I worry that this tradwife trend is the antithesis to all of the forms of empowerment that I mentioned above. It encourages women to forego their education in favor of young motherhood. It props up women who say their form of birth control is prayer. Many tradwives homeschool their kids and thus often rob them of the opportunity to learn about and perhaps even come to understand viewpoints that are different from their own. The people who promote this type of lifestyle will claim that the most important thing to them is the nuclear family. Meanwhile, raising kids with a disempowered mother and relying on antiquated gender roles as an excuse to take away her autonomy is, again, statistically, one of the most potentially harmful things that you can do to your children and the family unit. I also worry that the tradwife trend is part of a greater shift of online discourse toward tradition. Here's a tweet I saw that got 315,000 likes in just a few days that states, "Men will literally choose a shy, polite, soft woman with zero achievements over an arrogant career woman." Before I met my husband, I used to see posts like that, posts that are kind of like anti-female success, and I would get so nervous because being a writer and an artist on my own accord, it was so important to me. Actually, for a lot of my adolescence and young adulthood, my writing was probably the most important thing to me. But I also wanted to get married. I wanted to have kids. I wanted to love and be loved in return. So I used to hear opinions like, men are intimidated by successful women, and I would worry that success and domestic felicity were mutually exclusive. Like I would have to choose between being an artist and having a successful career and being intellectually fulfilled, or being loved. But the statistics say I actually had nothing to worry about. According to a study by the Hamilton Project, almost all financial demographics of women are getting married less and less over time, except for women who are high earners, who are getting married more. It makes sense when you think about it. Like a shy, polite, soft woman with zero achievements in this economy?
Darling, please get a job. I need help with the finances. Our son is starving. I can't get a job. I'm literally soft and shy.
But sometimes people feel insecure or unlovable, and they think that seeking out a weaker or less accomplished spouse might make their spouse more easily impressed by them and maybe less likely to leave them. And this isn't a dating advice channel, but remember that for a long-term marriage, you aren't just looking for somebody who's easy to boss around. You're looking for a teammate, someone to win with, not someone to win against. My grandfather had 7 sons, and he would always tell them the most important thing you will ever do for your kids is choose their mother. And I believe that a lot of the studies that I've cited in this video support him. But if you married young or had kids young and all of this sounds like doom and gloom, I really don't mean to communicate that. If you notice, many of the forms of empowerment that I mentioned above are pretty easily attainable. Like, I'm not saying that you need to become an astronaut and run a Fortune 500 company, all while being president of the PTA and packing homemade meals for your kids and husband every weekday. It's simple things, like building a social circle, learning about and potentially using birth control, finishing school, and making a budget to understand your household expenses. I need to work on that. I need to work on that last one. You don't need to get a PhD to be empowered. Empowerment can come from reading great literature, experiencing mind-warping works of art, getting physically stronger, meditating, traveling to cultures entirely different from your own, talking to people with different opinions and ideas that make you mad and make you argue, and then make you realize that you can't defend the way you feel, which in turn causes you to question your whole life view. And maybe you'll go through all these empowering experiences and realize that your opinions haven't changed and you were right all along. But you have to go through your hero's journey first. You have to go stare at a horizon line for long enough until the universe starts speaking to you.
I knew I was smarter than those assholes.
And I also wanted to include the second article about the Hamptons people because I think it's a great example of how these antiquated gender roles can be toxic for men as well. These videos you see on social media, which I really sometimes doubt the validity of, the girl saying they would never marry a man making $75,000 a year, they would never accept an engagement ring worth less than 6 figures.
Would you date a guy that makes $75K a year?
That's so cute. No.
How much should a guy make for you to date him seriously?
A good 250 to 300K.
How much do you expect him to make?
$1 million-ish.
This is just another offshoot of patriarchal thinking.
Honey, please hold our son. He doesn't even know you. I can't. I'm increasing shareholder value.
And if Brandon Miller was feeling so much economic pressure as the son of a real estate mogul living in a $15 million Hamptons mansion that he fucking killed himself, then imagine how much pressure the young working class dad feels whose hours worked determine if his kids will eat that month or be taken away by the state. If Hannah Nealman is driven to exhaustion by maternal responsibilities, even as one of the heiresses of the JetBlue fortune, then imagine how a single mom feels whose tips or commission will determine if her kids get to go to the doctor or not. And people with those concerns are far more numerous than the trad moms and the rich husbands. They just don't have time to post TikToks every day. You shouldn't treat your spouse like a money-making machine in the same way that you shouldn't treat your spouse like a baby-making machine. We all benefit when we recognize the humanity in one another and the complexity in one another. In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius writes that all beings in nature fulfill their purpose, and you, as a human, must do the same. The spider builds a web, the seed grows into a plant, fire rises, and stones fall. They do these things not because they are waiting for accolades or applause, but because it's in their nature. So, what is the nature of humans? Our destiny in the natural order of things? According to the Stoics, it is to be social and cooperative with the greater whole, to live in a way that is harmonious and aligned with nature, and to be good and virtuous. Thus, the greatest crime against nature that you can commit is that of unfulfilled potential. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have forgotten the value of your dignity, the worth of your potential. You were made for a purpose, to work with others in harmony." Close quote. Marcus Aurelius wasn't against the accumulation of wealth, but he called wealth the smallest of things. So let the stories of the late debtor and the former ballerina be a warning of what can happen to a human soul when it is taken from its original fluid form and instead beaten down into a walking stereotype. We are all far more complex than the roles that were assigned to us at birth. We are more complex than what our parents expected of us, we're more complex than what our children want from us, and we are more complex than who we thought we would be when we were kids. Humanity is destined for far greater than the simple accumulation of material things, and we're destined for greater than a never-ending list of domestic chores. Both of those things are important parts of day-to-day life, but they are not your entire identity. Your life, like nature, needs balance. You are destined for more, fellow human. You are destined for harmony. It's in your nature. I'm Siobhan Breyer Aguilar. I'm a writer. I have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for on my blog. If you require writing, editing, or SEO services, I work through Inkless Writing Agency, who you can contact by emailing info@inklessagency.com. If you're listening to this, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, you should definitely subscribe to my channel, because that was, I just looked it up, that was 14,525 words that I said that you listened to. So I think you like me. You should subscribe to my channel. Okay, that's all. Bye.
Our son is starving.